A letter no one knew existed, a location no one expected, and a message written by the one man who rarely spoke unless it mattered most, Prince Philip. Buried deep within a locked Windsor drawer, the sealed envelope stunned Queen Camilla, and 3 minutes later, she was in tears. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The discovery was almost accidental, an aging drawer in one of Windsor's lesser-used private studies, long untouched and scheduled for archival review. Inside it, among mundane files and outdated stationery, was a single envelope, heavy, yellowed at the edges, and sealed with the personal wax crest of the late Prince Philip. The moment it was spotted, something shifted in the room. The letter was clearly not meant to be found casually. Its message, scrawled across the front in Philip's unmistakably firm hand, read simply, "For Camilla. To be opened in solitude after my passing and only when the time feels right." It had never been mentioned, not once, not by Elizabeth, not by Charles, not even in the months following Philip's funeral. And now suddenly it stood in Camilla's hands like a relic from the past, demanding to be heard. She waited until the evening to open it. No staff, no advisors, just silence, and the weight of a legacy pressing down. Those who saw her before she entered her private quarters described her as composed, even curious. But what happened next would unravel that composure in a matter of minutes. According to an aide stationed outside her door, a quiet gasp was followed by a long, stifled sob, and then silence, broken only by the occasional muffled sound of grief. When she emerged, her eyes were red, her shoulders trembling. She said nothing, but her face said everything. The Queen Consort, known for navigating storms with poise, had been emotionally undone by words written by a man no longer alive. Words spread quickly. Charles was informed immediately. He rushed to her side, expecting to console, but when he asked what the letter said, Camilla only shook her head. "You don't want to know," she whispered, yet Charles insisted the contents be kept private. The letter was placed in a locked drawer in her personal desk. And in that moment, what should have been a forgotten piece of the past became the ignition point of a royal reckoning. What had Philip written to her? Why had it been hidden? And why, after reading it, did Camilla's world seem to come undone? But what exactly did Prince Philip write that could break Camilla, the woman known for keeping a steady face so completely? For years, Philip's silence was interpreted as acceptance. But his letter revealed a hidden storm, one that painted Camilla not as a successor to Queen Elizabeth, but as a symbol of what had gone terribly wrong. The letter began without pleasantries. There was no warm introduction, no gentle lead-in. Philip wrote with a sharpness honed by decades of discipline, and every word carried the force of a man who had spent his life defending an institution he believed was being slowly undone. His tone was measured, yet unmistakably cold. He addressed Camilla by name, not title, and made it clear that what he was about to say was not born from spite, but from sorrow. He began by acknowledging the inevitable changes that came with time, but swiftly moved to express his alarm at how certain principles had been abandoned in the process. With piercing clarity, he wrote that her ascent had come at the cost of tradition, that the monarchy had bent itself unnaturally to accommodate her presence, and that in doing so, something sacred had been lost. Camilla read those lines over and over. Philip didn't accuse her outright, but he didn't have to. He referenced ceremonies altered, roles reshuffled, and long-standing customs quietly bypassed, all for the sake of inclusion, all under the justification of modernization. He questioned whether this evolution had truly been for the people, or whether it was designed to shield the crown from internal controversy. Then came the line that would haunt her the most. In choosing comfort over continuity, the throne trades permanence for convenience. It was a devastating sentence. Camilla had always feared that behind Philip's courteous silence lay judgment. Now, in black ink, that fear had crystallized into reality. He went further, speaking not just of her role, but of Queen Elizabeth's legacy. Without naming her outright, Philip hinted at a quiet betrayal, not a treason of law, but one of intent. That the Queen had built the monarchy with restraint, duty, and self-erasure, and that, These values had been eroded in the name of emotional repair. Camilla had once believed that time had healed the monarchy's internal wounds. Now she realized those wounds had simply been ignored, and Philip had chosen his final words to reopen them. The tears she shed weren't merely for being scolded, they were for the weight of guilt she never expected to face. Legacy. That was the word that lingered long after the letter had been folded and locked away. Not her legacy. His, hers, the monarchy's. The quiet implication that she had contributed to its fading resonance left Camilla unmoored, emotionally gutted in a way no public scandal had ever managed. This wasn't a tabloid. It wasn't public opinion. It was the verdict of the one man who had never needed to raise his voice to make the entire palace listen. But while Camilla wept in private, another figure in the palace found themselves implicated in the letter's broader implications. Philip's letter wasn't just about Camilla. It carried a piercing message for his son, King Charles, one that challenged his leadership, his choices, and his allegiance. The king's composure was never meant to be tested like this. The words struck like iron across fragile glass. Philip, a man known for his unwavering loyalty to the institution, had broken tradition in his final act, not with a declaration, but with a warning. He questioned Charles not as a father to a son, but as a guardian to a future king. The letter referenced Charles's long-standing pursuit of love and companionship, but with a tone that felt less like understanding and more like indictment. He wrote of the need for companionship over clarity, a line so surgically placed that its true meaning couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just about Camilla. It was about every moment Charles had chosen personal emotion over public obligation. For Philip, the crown was not a comfort, it was a command, and Charles, in his eyes, had blurred the two. Charles read the letter in solitude, gripping it in silence as hours passed with no movement, no response. When he finally emerged from the room, his face was pale with something deeper than shock. It was wounded pride. Those close to him said he ordered immediate privacy, dismissing staff and silencing press inquiries. But behind closed doors, the rage was undeniable. He lashed out at advisors, called the letter a betrayal from beyond the grave, and questioned why it had ever been found. He demanded to know who had allowed Camilla to read it first. He was not simply a king reacting to criticism. He was a son shattered by his father's final judgment. Camilla, emotionally raw from her own reckoning, pleaded with Charles for understanding. She asked him to speak, to share the weight of what they both now carried. But he refused. His silence wasn't strength, it was distance. In the days that followed, Charles barely addressed her. Not because he blamed her, but because he didn't know where to place the shame. To be rebuked by his father in death, after a lifetime spent chasing elusive approval, left him hollow. Every decision, every compromise he had made for love now stood on trial in court of his own conscience. And in that courtroom, Philip's letter had already delivered its sentence. What made it worse was the depth of truth he couldn't deny. The monarchy had changed under his watch. The rules had softened, the image had shifted. And while Charles had hoped it would usher in a gentler, more modern reign, his father's words reframed it as weakness, as failure. The emotional storm brewing inside the king was no longer just personal. It was political, spiritual, and existential. And as he attempted to contain it, one name, buried halfway through the letter, suddenly rose to the surface, a name neither Charles nor Camilla had anticipated, but one that would set off the next chain reaction in this unraveling royal storm. As royal tempers clashed behind palace walls, one unexpected name surfaced from Philip's letter, one that neither Charles nor Camilla could ignore. Prince Philip's words carried a promise made to his wife and a warning for those who would stray from her legacy. Elizabeth's presence loomed larger than ever, and Camilla now found herself in direct comparison to a queen who never had to demand respect. In the pages of that letter, Queen Elizabeth was not merely remembered, she was resurrected. Philip spoke of her with a tone that trembled between reverence and grief, but also something sterner. Duty. He wrote of her unflinching composure, her unwavering discipline, her refusal to ever place herself above the institution she served. For Philip, Elizabeth had not simply worn the crown, she was the crown. and anyone who followed in her place would need to carry more than the title. They would need to embody the spirit. Camilla, reading these lines, felt the words close in around her. The contrast was brutal. Elizabeth had built her reign in silence, sacrifice, and stoicism. Camilla, on the other hand, had arrived into royalty after decades of public controversy, climbing her way into the role not through heritage, but through persistence. Philip made no personal attack, but the implication was searing. He reminded her that respect is not conferred with a coronation, but earned through the quiet, consistent burden of service. He wrote that the monarchy was fragile, now fractured by change, softened by compromise, and he feared that Elizabeth's departure had left it exposed. In a line that stopped Camilla cold, he wrote, "The crown cannot rest on uncertain ground. It must find purchase in character. It wasn't just a call to conscience. It was a direct challenge." Charles did not escape the scrutiny either. Philip urged his son to remember where the monarchy had come from and who had carried it through some of its darkest hours. He implored him not to rush into redefinition, but to remember the foundation upon which everything had been built, Elizabeth's unshakable integrity. That integrity, Philip warned, must not become a relic of the past, but the benchmark for the future. There was an undeniable tone of resentment in how quickly roles had shifted after Elizabeth's death. Ceremonies redrawn, faces reshuffled, traditions abandoned with little pause. Philip's voice, though gone, felt like thunder rolling back over decisions already made. Camilla sat with this realization for hours, that she could not and perhaps would never emerge from the Queen's shadow. And worse still, that every act she made in the name of progress might be seen as erasure of the woman who had defined a generation. The tears came not just from guilt, but from helplessness. How could she live up to a standard that had never needed defense, never needed correction, and never once had to ask to be revered? The letter's tone wasn't cruel, but it was clear. Elizabeth's legacy was not negotiable, and anyone who hoped to stand in her place had to carry its full, unrelenting weight. But before Camilla could process the full weight of Philip's words, a hidden second page was discovered, and it was addressed to someone else entirely, a separate page, a private message, and a royal heir who had no idea the burden was already waiting. Prince William receives a piece of the past with instructions that may alter the future. Tucked behind the original letter, sealed in a thinner fold of parchment, was a second page marked only with a single word, William. It was addressed not with title, not with rank, but with intimacy. It had not been written for public knowledge, nor for ceremonial reflection. This was not protocol, it was legacy passed from one man to another. Philip's tone shifted here. It was less confrontational, more composed but heavy with expectation. He called William the bridge between honor and evolution, a title not bestowed lightly. He wrote that the future of the monarchy would not rest in the shoulders of those who reigned, but in the character of those who would redefine what reigning even meant. Philip urged him not to lead with appeasement, but with principle, not to bend to public pressure for the sake of headlines, but to stand still when the winds of modernity began to howl. He acknowledged the necessity of change, but warned that change without conviction was simply erosion. Then came the line that struck deepest: "Do not inherit the crown as it is, inherit it as it should be." It wasn't just guidance, it was a demand. And within it lay a subtle rebuke of Charles, of the compromises made, of the emotional decisions that had chipped away at the bedrock of tradition. William, sources say, read the page twice, then a third time. He said nothing for hours. According to those closest to the palace, what followed was a long, hushed conversation between William and Catherine. No aides, no advisors, just the two of them behind locked doors. Whatever was discussed, it marked a shift. William, who had long remained poised in the center, began leaning toward the past, not in rejection of his father, but in defense of something deeper. He spoke less in meetings. His tone became firmer. He requested access to ceremonial archives rarely used. To some, it was clear he was preparing, not for the throne, but for a reckoning. The impact of that letter wasn't immediate, but it was profound. William had carried the weight of expectation his entire life, but now He was carrying something else, instruction, from the very man who had stood silently beside the Queen for 7 decades, a man who had watched from the shadows but never let them define him. For William, this was no longer a matter of role or timing, it was about readiness. And in Philip's eyes, it was clear William was not just next in line, he was the final line of defense. And it wouldn't take long for the ripple effect of that message to reach a royal who had been silent for far too long, Prince Harry. Though not addressed directly, Philip's letter referenced those who walked away, reopening the wound of Prince Harry's departure. But what truly stunned the family was how Philip defined Harry's legacy not as a rebel, but as a warning. It was one-line cryptic, restrained, yet loaded with meaning. Let those who broke from duty in search of identity serve as a reminder that freedom without foundation is not liberation, but exile. No names were mentioned, no finger pointed, and yet everyone knew. The words lingered in the air like smoke, drifting toward a truth no one wanted to speak. Camilla, still raw from her own reckoning, interpreted it instantly as condemnation. In her eyes, it was Philip drawing a line between commitment and chaos, and placing Harry firmly on the wrong side. Charles, already rattled by the Earl's criticisms in the letter, took it as something more personal. He read it as a judgment not just on Harry, but on himself as a father who had failed to anchor his son to the monarchy's core values. He didn't say it aloud, but those close to him noticed how quickly the tension in his face returned when the passage was mentioned. The guilt of losing Harry to the outside world, paired with the quiet accusation from his father, was a blow Charles had not anticipated. But for William, the impact was different. The letter placed him in an emotional crossfire, bound to the institution that defined his life, but forever linked by blood to the brother who had walked away from it. He knew what Philip meant, and part of him agreed. Yet another part, buried deeper, felt protective. William had watched Harry unravel under the weight of royal expectation. He had seen the walls closing in around him long before the public did, and while their paths had splintered, the wound of separation had never truly healed. Now, to see Harry cast not as misunderstood, but as a cautionary tale, left William torn between allegiance and affection. He said nothing publicly, but his demeanor shifted his public poise, now carrying a flicker of private unrest. The quote ignited conversations across the country. Was Harry a warning or a symptom? Was his departure the collapse of royal strength or the exposure of its flaws? The press speculated. Pundits dissected. And then, just when the palace thought the echo had faded, Harry responded. Not with an interview, not with anger, but with a cryptic 2-sentence post from California. Some things are seen only when you leave the room. That doesn't mean you were wrong to walk out. It was a subtle defiance cloaked in reflection, and it reminded the monarchy and the world that even in absence, Harry's presence still demanded to be felt. But while the letter fractured the present, its final line shook the monarchy's foundation and left Camilla with a decision that could define her reign. It was just one sentence, the final line of Philip's letter, but its words sliced through the layers of power, tradition and pretense, and left Camilla gasping for air. The crown is not worn by those who take it, but by those the people believe in. That was it. No explanation, no elaboration. But for Camilla, it was more than enough. It was the line that stripped away titles, ceremonies, and protocols, and exposed the brutal truth at the heart of monarchy. Without the people's faith, the crown is nothing more than an ornament. In one stroke, Philip had challenged the very foundation of her reign. Camilla had worn the title, sat beside the king, and stood on royal balconies. But this sentence didn't question her actions. It questioned her acceptance. And worse, it echoed everything she had spent years trying to bury. That for many, she was still not the queen they had envisioned. The moment those words were read, Camilla's face reportedly paled. It wasn't the formality of the line, it was the finality. It felt like a verdict. Her tears, already close after the emotional unraveling of the earlier pages, spilled freely. But this time, they weren't just tears of grief. They were tears of confrontation with herself, with her image, with the cold realization that even in her highest role, she was still on trial. Across the palace, staff moved with uneasy caution. Something had shifted. The letter that had started as a private reflection had now become a royal earthquake. Charles, when told of the final line, remained unreadable. He refused to speak on it, refused to issue a comment. And that silence spoke louder than any defense. It signaled to the public and the press that something in those words had landed exactly where Philip intended. Sue. N. The line was everywhere. Circulating through headlines, whispered on talk shows, printed on the front pages of tabloids and broadsheets alike. The crown is not worn by those who take it. It became a quote, a challenge, a slogan. And while some defended Camilla's journey, others saw in Philip's sentence the voice of a man who had watched the old monarchy fade and feared what might take its place. For Camilla, the quote became a mirror, cold and unrelenting. It reflected not the woman she had fought to become, but the perception she could never escape. The battles she thought she had won, the public acceptance, the royal ceremonies, the softened headlines all seemed to evaporate under one sentence written by a man no longer alive. It was as if Philip had known that his final words would outlive him, that his quiet, pointed reminder would pierce the fabric of royal reinvention and force the House of Windsor to face the one thing it could never manufacture: trust. But in the midst of uncertainty, Camilla makes an unthinkable move, one that no royal saw coming. Shattered by legacy, overwhelmed by expectation, and shaken by words from the grave, Camilla makes a decision in the quiet of Windsor that could alter the future of the monarchy forever. It wasn't announced with fanfare, no formal statement, no grand address, just a quiet withdrawal. After days of emotional turbulence sparked by Prince Philip's posthumous letter, Camilla requested to temporarily step back from public duties. The official line, emotional exhaustion. But those inside the palace knew better. This wasn't about rest, it was about reckoning. For Camilla, the weight of Philip's final sentence had become unbearable. It had exposed something she had buried deep, the unspoken fear that no matter how far she had come, she might never fully belong. And now, with the nation's eyes fixed on every word, every silence, every absence, Camilla vanished from the public stage, leaving behind more questions than answers. But one appearance did not go unnoticed. In the early hours of a rain-soaked morning, Camilla was quietly seen paying respects at the Queen's tomb. Alone, no escort, no photographers, just a solitary woman confronting the legacy of the woman whose shadow she had always walked behind. For royal watchers, it was a moment laced with symbolism, a gesture of humility, an apology, or perhaps an admission that her crown had always sat uneasily atop her head. Whatever the intention, it was clear Camilla was not stepping away from duty. She was stepping into her own silence, choosing to reflect rather than respond. Meanwhile, Charles faced the storm alone. With Camilla out of sight, the king was left to steady a monarchy rocked by grief, scandal, and now a symbolic retreat. Public engagements continued, but the tone had shifted. Where once there was poise, now there was strain. Charles appeared gaunt, distracted, occasionally irritable. He dismissed questions about Camilla with curt phrases, but behind palace walls, aides reported growing concern. The monarchy's image, already delicate, was unraveling without its queen consort. And in tabloids across the country, headlines screamed of a royal vacuum, of a crown wobbling in the wind. Royal commentators didn't hold back. They called Camilla's move a silent abdication of influence. Others branded it a quiet crisis, one that exposed just how fragile her place in the royal structure remained. For years, Camilla had fought to shift public perception, to move from scandal to acceptance. But now, stripped of palace walls and pageantry, the world saw her plainly for what may have been the first time. Not a figure of power, not a symbol of resilience, but a woman uncertain, burdened, and utterly human beneath the weight of royal expectation. And so, the palace grew quieter. Camilla's absence was felt not just in events missed or photos left unposed. It was in the silence between royal updates, in the awkward smiles of Charles at solo appearances, in the unresolved tension left hanging after a letter that changed everything. Yet power, like nature, abhors a vacuum. And as Camilla retreats into the shadows of reflection, another royal steps into the vacuum, unexpected, unwavering, and ready. As the royal house reels from the emotional chaos, one figure quietly steps forward. Catherine, Princess of Wales, isn't asking for a crown. But through action, integrity, and grace, she begins to claim the monarchy's heart. While others faltered, Catherine remained unwavering. She did not speak about the letter. She did not need to. Her silence was its own language, measured, composed, dignified. In the vacuum left by Camilla's retreat, it was Catherine who filled the space, not with declarations, but with presence. Her calendar quietly expanded. School visits, hospital wards, military ceremonies, each appearance met with warmth, not fanfare. There were no overt gestures, no political maneuvers, but to the public it was unmistakable. Catherine was rising. And she wasn't demanding the spotlight. The spotlight, it seemed, was following her. Public opinion shifted rapidly. As polls reflected wavering support for Charles and confusion around Camilla's future, one name surged in favor: Catherine. She had long been admired, but now she was trusted. Seen as the calm within the storm, the royal who didn't speak above the noise but who cut through it with consistency and grace. In her, the people saw not only a future queen but a present compass, someone who could hold tradition in one hand and empathy in the other, someone who didn't just wear a title but embodied its weight without asking for pity. Though Catherine never claimed to follow Philip's vision, those close to the palace couldn't help but draw the parallel. Philip had written of integrity, restraint, and the silent strength behind the throne. Catherine, in her quiet resolve, reflected all three. She never sought to overshadow Charles, nor confront Camilla's absence. Yet her growing visibility felt less like ambition and more like inevitability. The monarchy needed an anchor, and Catherine, with every step, became the steady rhythm the public leaned into. Inside the palace, something subtle but undeniable was taking shape. William and Catherine began to appear more and more as the face of the monarchy, not officially, not publicly stated, but in the court of public opinion. Perception was reality. The way they carried themselves, the bond they displayed, the sense of unity they felt, like the monarchy's moral center. Commentators didn't hesitate. Phrases like the new Elizabeth and Philip began to echo across headlines. Not in appearance, but in energy, in spirit. The sense that perhaps from this whirlwind of emotion and legacy, a new era was being born, not forced, not announced, but felt. And yet, even as Catherine symbolized hope, the monarchy remained at a crossroads. For while her presence steadied the present, the war Philip's letter ignited was far from over. But behind the pageantry, one truth remains: Philip's final letter didn't end a chapter. It opened a war between past and present, legacy and reinvention. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.